Look what I got. I got an eraser. All right. Number 4. We're about to talk about some really big numbers, and I just want to refresh your memory on how big a number $1 trillion is, right? Because sometimes scalability is difficult, and it's difficult to imagine how much $1 trillion is. So, number 4, 1 trillion. How big a number is that? Well, let me put it this way. If you spent $1 million per day for, between now and when Jesus Christ of Nazareth walked the earth. So, for 2020 years, you wouldn't have spent $1 trillion. You would have, in fact, spent about $737 billion in that time. And if you think about that, if you really stop and think about spending $1 million a day for over 2,000 years, and not to have spent $1 trillion, I hope that helps out in terms of scalability, because what we're about to talk to is crazy. So that's number 4. Number 5. I want to take my little. Let's talk about government spending. So let me adjust my little camera here, and so you can see that. Let's talk about government spending, because it really is difficult to imagine what our government spends. So for fiscal 2020, the government is going to spend somewhere, and these are rounded off numbers, okay, but somewhere in the neighborhood of, let me look, $4.9 trillion. 4.9, almost $5 trillion is what the government is going to spend. And what I wanted to do is just give you kind of an idea of how that money is spent. So this will be very quick, but the vast majority of that almost $5 trillion is going to be spent on what are called mandatory entitlements. So these are things that the government doesn't have, or Congress doesn't have an option. They've already committed to spending this money. And this is largely things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, unemployment, things like that. So that makes up the bulk of what the government spends money on. All right. And again, I'm going to use some color coding. That's mandatory spending. The government or the Congress really doesn't have a choice and is committed to spending that. And that's versus discretionary spending. So if we look at the discretionary spending here, the discretionary spending makes up about 31% of the budget. And that's stuff that Congress has a choice on. They can allocate funds to those components. Now, discretionary spending is split up almost perfectly 50-50 between defense and then every other agency of the U.S. government. So these are all agencies. So think of agencies like the FBI, the SEC, the FAA. It's an alphabet soup, right? But all of those other agencies fall within that little slice of discretionary spending, right? And then last but not least, this 8% is interest, right? Because when the government needs to borrow money, they issue securities, and they have to pay interest on those securities. Otherwise, people won't buy them. And that makes up the government spending, okay? Now, number 6, very quickly, let's talk about revenue, all right? So where does tax revenue come from? So we expect this year, the government expects to take in about 3.8, that's not a very good 8, about $3.8 trillion in revenue, and by far the largest portion of that, 50% of that revenue, is going to come from income tax. So when you pay your federal income taxes, that makes up the bulk of it right there. And I make sure you know that the vast majority of the revenue comes from income tax, okay? That would be good to know. I'm just saying, okay? Now, the other big chunk of income tax comes from payroll taxes. So if you've ever gotten your paycheck and, you get how much you made, and then all of a sudden FICA and all these other people are taking money out, well, that's Social Security and Medicaid and all those payroll taxes make up about 36%. And then about 7% of the income comes from corporate taxes. So this right here is the only portion that corporate taxes makes up. And then that 4%, that little slice, is tariffs. You've heard a lot about tariffs in the news lately, especially with the President Trump and some of his policies in the past couple of years. So tariffs make up about 4% of the government income. And then there's about 3% that's other stuff. So, the Fed and other agencies hold some assets that mature and stuff like that. But anyway, all right, so that's 5 and 6, government spending. And number 6 was taxation.